if we were now in the room, Brian Holmes was about to come into the room and start a seminar, and he loved the seminar more than the lecture. He was not a wonderfully good lecturer, but he loved the discussion and the argument of the seminar. He'd come into the room and he would normally, very roughly, with a stick of chalk, draw four circles on the blackboard using a plate or something he'd found that was round to draw the circles. And so what he would start with, your first encounter with him would have been something like this. He would have drawn on the blackboard four circles. And it would have been much rougher. I've done a rather more beautiful presentation than he would have done. And the four circles would have said norms, institutions, resources, and mental states. And then we would have described what's going on in those. Let's take the norms first. The norms are the opinions. The norms are the statements of what should be the case. And in the smaller writing, the segments of we have norms about education, we have norms about the law, we have norms about politics, we have norms about social welfare, we have all sorts of norms, things that we think ought to be the case. It ought to be illegal for children to buy cigarettes. It ought to be illegal for people to park on a double yellow line. It ought to be all of those views about the law. About education, our heads are full of ideas of what should be the case. Children ought to be in school from age 5 to 18. Children in school ought to study mathematics through their whole career. Children in school should study at least one foreign language so that they can operate in an international world. We got these norms coming out of our ears, and they are all opinions about how the world should run. So that's the first circle, is norms. The second circle is about institutions. And we have educational institutions, we have schools, and we have universities, we have legal institutions, we have law courts, we have police, we have lawyers, we have associations that give qualifications to lawyers, grant lawyers licenses. All of those things are institutions. And, and of course, we have norms about politics, how politics should be organized, how politicians should operate, what we expect of politicians. And we have social welfare, we have institutions of marriage, of the family, of support from local government for people in need. And these are statements about institutions are statements of fact. They are statements about the way the world is. And then the other two circles, and the next two circles are less important, and you'll see why later. The question of resources. I think the circle about resources is Holmes's effort to acknowledge the fact that we are constrained by the physical world. There is only so much coal in the world. There is only so much sunshine in the world. There is only so much money allocated to education. We operate within restricted resources. And this was the physicist saying to you, at the bottom, underneath everything else, the physical world limits what we can do, and his uh, he talked about it very little. He talked about resources very little. His major example of uh, the case where resources really bit into education was the in the early 1970s. There'd been a crisis over the delivery of oil. There'd been a shortage of oil, and it brought home to everybody that carbon-based fuels couldn't go on forever. And this was his example of how the abundance or lack of abundance of material resources could affect education, among other things in society. And mental states, uh, he'd studied in the United States. He'd studied in the United States, and he'd been impressed by the work of a sociologist called Gunnar Myrdal. And Gunnar Myrdal said that we have uh, two kinds of norms, if you like. We have what Myrdal called upper valuations and lower valuations. If I say to you, uh, uh, "Are you going to study tonight?" Uh, and you say, "Yes, of course I'm going to study tonight." You will tell me when you tell me uh, your opinion. You will give me your upper valuation. You will tell me the value that you think I want to hear. If I actually watch what you do and discover that you haven't been studying you aren't going to study tonight, you're going to go out to party, you're going to have dinner with friends, you're going to waste time scrolling through YouTube or Red Note or whatever it is, those actions are determined by what Gunnar Myrdal called your lower valuations. So Myrdal was particularly interested in race. So if you say to somebody, "What do you think about race?" Everybody says, "I think all people are born equal. I think we shouldn't be drawing distinctions of between different racial groups. There is no biological basis for racial distinctions." But then if you say to them, "Well, but would you let your daughter marry somebody from a different race?" "Oh no, that's a different thing altogether." Lower valuations are exhibited in what people do, and upper valuations are exhibited in what they say. And in an attempt to bring that in, that people don't always live up to their norms, don't always live up to their upper valuations, Holmes introduced this fourth circle, mental states, roughly equivalent to Myrdal's lower valuations, so that you can say, well, teachers say they're in favour of this educational reform, but when you go into the classroom, they don't do it. I mean, I think that teachers ought to be listening to their students more carefully. They should be getting their students engaged in discussion. That's what a modern classroom looks like. Lots of discussion and questions and clarification. And now you look at what I'm doing. I'm sitting in front of you and talking at you. My lower valuation is that the teacher teaches and the students listen, whereas my upper valuation is we co-create knowledge in the classroom. We're all working together to produce knowledge. We need, he introduced mental states in an effort to understand some of these contradictions in human behavior. So that's the background. Now we come to the problem approach. Brian argued that a problem, and I've put problem in quotation marks because it's a technical use of the word problem. For him, a problem was when one thing changed in the education system and something else didn't change. So we're looking for my first year of teaching. 1972, I was a brand new teacher in a secondary school, and the government decided that they were going to raise the school leaving age. They were going to raise the school leaving age from the age of 15 to the age of 16. In 1971, children left school when they were 15. In 1972, children left school when they were 16. Look what that means. There was a change of norms, and changes of norms can be quite sudden because it doesn't depend on evidence, it doesn't depend on how the world is. The government can simply say children are going to stay in school for an extra year. Now, what hadn't changed? Well, the institutions hadn't changed, the school hadn't changed, the uh, curriculum hadn't changed, the examinations hadn't changed, and what was happening was that we had a lot of children who were between the ages of 15 and 16. They were in school when they hadn't wanted to be. They would rather have been not in school. And they were following a curriculum that had been prepared for and decided for a group of children that didn't include them. We had to deal with children who were in school but didn't want to be, and the curriculum that we had to offer them, the institution changed more slowly, so they didn't have a curriculum that was suitable for their needs. And this is typical that a norm can change very quickly and an institution changes much more slowly, and that's uh, a typical source of problems in education. And it took years literally for the curriculum to be reformed in England in order to cater to the needs of those new pupils who were being forced to stay on in schools when they uh, didn't want to. There was another problem quite separately. As you can imagine, the norms had changed. The government said these children should stay in school until they're 16. But the mental states of teachers hadn't changed. I still went into the classroom and thought, why am I spending my time on these children? They don't want to be here. I don't want to be here. It's a disaster for all of us. It took time for teachers to adjust their mental states in order to feel that every child should be in school until the age of 16. So different problems arise because different parts of the world, the norms, the institutions, the resources, or the mental states change at different rates from the other parts. And it's that mismatch that creates the problems, creates the focus for study in the problem solving approach to comparative education. And notice that that problem of expanding secondary education and needing to uh, diversify the curriculum in order to cater for the broader group of students who were now present had happened in the United States in the early 20th century. It happened in England in 1970s. It happened in other countries at different times. The similar problem can happen at different times in different countries. You identify the change, a change in the student body, lack of change in the curriculum, and that problem isn't tied to a particular timetable. You can study different countries at different times in order to illuminate the problem. So that's the central ideas of the Holmes problem-solving approach to comparative education. We have in our heads very different ideas of how the world should be conducted. And particularly, this is true at a national level. And what Holmes says is the way that you work out what the national norms are the following. There are probably some texts that are crucial to understanding the attitudes of a nation. Uh, if you're looking at England, I think if you're looking at England 50 years ago, but less so today, you would have said the Bible was a fundamental, foundational document. People knew the Bible and the text. I think that you would say there are certain philosophers. So if you wanted to know the background thinking, philosophical thinking of English people, you would read the philosopher John Locke, maybe David Hume. If you wanted to know the state of thinking on education, you'd look at the law of the land, or you might look at the constitution. So he's suggesting that there are these key documents that you can look to, perhaps a national poet, a national playwright, a very famous, uh, a fondly regarded novelist. You might find the sense of the nation bubbling through some of those documents. And so he suggests if you want to understand how French people think, again, you might look to the Bible. He argues, I'm not sure that's still true. If you want a philosopher who characterizes French thinking, you would go to Descartes. If you wanted to, uh, in literature, you might look at Victor Hugo, will embody some of the values of the nation. And if you look at the Constitution, you will see other. If you, again, now, if you go to China, if you wanted to understand what the fundamental ways of thinking of Chinese people are, you might read Confucius or Lao Tzu. You might Uh, I'm, I mean, I was told very clearly there are four classic Chinese novels. If you want to understand how Chinese, first and foremost, go and read Dream of the Red Room, and it tell you an awful lot about the Chinese psyche. You might also want to look at the Constitution, uh, the latest statements of the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party. There are what Holmes was suggesting was you look at these key documents. In the United States, very clear, you cannot understand, you cannot have the faintest idea what's going on in American politics unless you uh, have read the Constitution, because the Constitution frames all debate and discussion in the United States. If you want to understand the philosophical thinking, you'd probably do well to read John Dewey and pragmatist philosophers. Uh, you might also look to the Bible because although there's distinct separation between church and state, religious thinking is still profoundly important in the United States. So there's a whole range of documents from which you should be able to distill with skill the sense of what the norms of a country are. That this is the second practical part of the understanding. Holmes is offering you a set of tools for evaluating or constructing for yourself an understanding of the normative values, the norms that first circle, the norms of a nation from specified documents. Now, the structure of what I am trying to do here is effectively a book review. I mean, it's not a review of a single book, it's a review of Brian Holmes's work. But somewhere or other, I have put a video on YouTube about writing a book review, and I offer to you what Brian Holmes offered to me as instructions when you're reviewing work is first of all, explain why the person is making the case. And I think I'm set that out in terms of Holmes was trying to bring his experience of the physical sciences to comparative education. The comparative education was growing rapidly in the period after 1945. There were huge debates about how comparative education could be made more secure, could be given scientific status, could be developed into a discipline. And Holmes had his proposal, which was to embody his insights from the physical sciences, from the physicist that he was, to create an approach, a method of comparative education. So that's what he did. I've tried as faithfully as I know how to present what he said as he said it. So up until now, I've tried not to let my own interpretation uh, break through to colour what I've been saying. But so now, what I'm going to do is give you my critique of what Holmes said, because and I'm trying to make sure that you know what's him and what's me, because that's important when you're when you're reading any book, when you're doing using any reference for your research. I think you ought to be doing these things. Think about a scholar, think about why they wrote what issue were they addressing, what did they actually say, and then what do you think of what they said. And what I think of what he said is I come back to the question of critical dualism, that there are opinions or norms and there are facts or institutions, and you will be looking at this and saying, if it's dualism, dualism is about two, why are there four circles? And so the first thing I want to do is to get rid of the third and fourth circle. I want to dismiss from thought mental states, because I do not like, I have never liked mental states. Uh, by the way, this is a fairly late addition to Holmes's work, when in much of his work there are only three circles. He introduced mental states because he wanted to explain that kind of resistance to change that one encounters in the world. If you're trying to encourage anybody, any group of people to change, they change more slowly than you might hope. And so I think he introduced the idea of mental states to account for that drag in the system. And I do not like the idea of mental states. The idea that you and I have motivations that are unknown to us, that are operating subconsciously, I really don't like that. I've said elsewhere, and I will continue to say, I don't think that we should apply theories to other people that we wouldn't like to have applied to ourselves. And I certainly don't like any theory that tells me how I'm thinking. Who has a right more than me to know how I'm thinking? Certainly not Gunnar Myrdal, not Freud, not Marx. I don't think anybody should be able to tell me how I'm thinking. And so I don't like the circle that says mental states. So I'm going to ignore mental states because I don't like that theoretical position. I think Holmes wasn't always comfortable with mental states, but he included it in his later work. I want to see that gone. The second the second circle I want to get rid of is that one of resources. I said to you, Holmes rarely spoke about resources, and the example he chose was the oil crisis of 1972, when the oil producing companies, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided they weren't going to getting enough money for their oil, and so they put the price of oil up, and the Western world was thrown into chaos. In England, we could only work 3 days a week and could only turn the lights on for 3 days a week because there wasn't enough oil to keep the machinery running. And that was Holmes's example of the way in which resources affected education. And I think that's a very bad example. I think it's a very bad example because it's actually an institutional problem. It was OPEC, it was the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, changed their norms. They said overnight, we need more money for the petrol we're selling. We're going to demand more money for the petrol. They changed the norms. The price of oil went up. That was institutionally confusing because it meant that countries that had adapted to one price could not immediately increase their consumption of oil because they couldn't find the money to do it. And it took time, but over time, economies adapted to the higher price of oil. And we are where we are today with oil being more expensive and it not being a huge problem. So, in my view, the example that he chose for resources was an extremely bad one, which could be catered for in the first two circles. So I'm not going to talk about resources. I mean, I understand his impulse. I understand his impulse to include the physical world because that does have an impact on us. Uh, if you live in a mountainous area, it's different from if you live on plain, open plains. But I'm not sure it needs incorporating that formally into the system. So I'm going to talk about only institutions and norms. And uh, I've said to you, Holmes suggested that you could find national norms by looking at key documents and particularly constitutions, law, works of accepted works of philosophers, maybe leading literature, and so on. And I think here he made a major mistake. I think there's a major mistake here that you and I have norms. I can think of myself one day I'm a smoker and wake up the next day and decide I'm never going to smoke again and stop smoking. I mean, it's not. I understand it's not as easy as it sounds, but it is possible. I could wake up today and say the best way of starting the day is a good strong cup of coffee. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible I could wake up tomorrow and say the best way of starting the day is with a good run round the park rather than having a cup of coffee. We can change our at an individual level, we can change our norms. And I am, as I think Holmes was at bottom, a methodological individualist. I think that society works because individuals make choices and they make choices over their personal norms. And I I have norms, you have norms, but they could change tomorrow. We could on a whim change our ideas. I think that's not true of nations. I think that a constitution is not a norm. A constitution is an institution. If you want to change the constitution, you know exactly what you have to do. You have to get, or in the United States, you have to get a majority in both houses of the the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. You have to have a two-thirds majority. You then have to have it ratified by a third of the states, so that the procedure by which you change a constitution is very clearly set out, uh, and you know how to do it. It cannot be changed overnight. Similarly, if you want to say we've given up on Descartes, we're now much more modern than Descartes, we want to embrace the work of Foucault, well then you know what you need to do. You need to ensure that the philosophy curriculum in universities has a special place for Foucault rather than for Descartes, and that philosopher underpins the thinking. I think we're seeing a move to that around the world, to a move away from very traditional philosophers towards more postmodern philosophers. Uh, we're seeing a shift, but it's a slow process that's done. It's not quite as well specified. It's not quite as clear as changing a constitution, but it's very clear how a philosopher becomes mainstream. It becomes accepted as part of the canon of philosophy. Similarly, with literature that resonates with people. So I think that Holmes was mistaken in thinking that you can identify norms through uh, national documents. I think that norms are something that individuals have. Holmes emphasized always that norms can change suddenly. Norms can change very quickly because they don't depend on evidence, they don't depend on changing the world. They simply involve you waking up in the morning and deciding today is going to be different. Today is going to be, I'm going to believe this instead of that. I've read the newspaper opinion piece this morning and I'm going to think that anybody who parks a car in the wrong place, the army should come along and destroy the car because that will teach people not to park in the wrong places. That's I can change my mind suddenly. What he didn't emphasize, and I think we see this increasingly in the world we live in today, is actually the opposite is also true. There is no amount of evidence in the world that can persuade you to change a norm if you don't want to. If you have a norm, if you believe that vaccination is unhealthy, if you believe that uh, autism results from measles and measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination, no amount of scientific evidence will convince you otherwise. If you believe that climate change is a hoax, no amount of scientific evidence will persuade you otherwise. And I think that this feature of the slowness with which norms can change is actually important and is part of the reason that I don't think we need to invoke mental states. There's plenty of conservatism and drag in norms without invoking some hidden mechanism that's going on behind our backs. I think that people don't necessarily change their norms when the evidence to any sane person suggests that they should. So that's my critique of what Holmes had to say. It doesn't, by the way, mean that I think it's useless. I think that it's actually uh, it it can inform it can inform studies of comparative education, but I think that it means that sometimes institutions change quicker than norms. And I think if you look around the world, you look at you look in England, we introduced a smoking ban. Oh, never mind in England. In Beijing, 10 years ago, you could not move in Beijing without choking on cigarette tobacco, cigarette smoke, because there was a norm that you could smoke anywhere and smoking was not frowned upon. It was a perfectly acceptable, socially acceptable thing to do. The government introduced, I don't think it even introduced a law, it introduced a regulation that smoking should not happen in public places, and the law was changed. That's an institutional change. Nowadays, if you walk around Beijing, you see much less smoking in public. The norm is changing slowly. I think you also see this in terms of sexual harassment. We have laws on gender equality. We have laws on uh, protection of women from violence and so on. And gradually, we're seeing a change in the norms of individuals as they adjust to the idea that some sorts of behaviour are unacceptable. So I think that it remains an interesting way of looking at systems, but it doesn't always pan out exactly the way in which Holmes imagined it did. And I think that I mean, my last comment on this is one of the things that one of the important things that Holmes taught me was this: what the professor says is not the last word. And what he said to me as an academic, and I pass this on to you as young academics, he said it's not good enough to be a Holmesian. He was arrogant enough to believe I was going to be a Holmesian in some form or other. But he said you must be either a Holmesian and or a Holmesian but. I think Holmes but I think Holmes and nobody is going to employ you to parrot the opinions of your professor. They're going to employ you for having your own ideas which build upon the ideas that you took from your professor. But you cannot make a career out of parroting opinions that you've heard from somebody else. So in I hope I've honoured his tradition by offering you a critique of what he had to say, as well as trying as accurately as I can to explain what he said. Yes, if I may, just one last thing, because I thought I'd finished and now I realise I've not told you the most important thing. I think, as Professor Lee noted, there's there's the difference between wishing for something to happen and making it happen. The world is obdurate. The world doesn't behave the way that we wish. And in particular, uh, Holmes was drawing attention to the fact that if you make a change, particularly you make a change in one institution, other parts of it in other institutions and other parts of institutions will change in ways that you didn't intend. Or maybe you did intend. You need to understand the linkages between different parts of the institutions. So we might say uh, the kind of link might be if we teach children in their mother tongue, their performance in attainment tests will increase. Or we may say if children study mathematics in greater depth in secondary school, they will find it easier to get a job in the employment market. There are links between different parts of the institutional pattern. And what Holmes said was the job of the comparative educationist was to find those links. If we do this, then that happens as a result of it. And he called those links sociological laws. And for years, whenever I got to a conference, Charles Walhutter, the South African comparative educationist, would greet me with the words, "Have you found any sociological laws yet?" And I was stumped by this question for a long time. What what are the sociological laws that we need to understand the links between one part of institutional pattern and another part of the institutional pattern? And it came to me only more recently that actually finding sociological laws is no difficulty at all. If you if you say if you look at what governments do, then clearly a lot of people have the belief that if you invest more in this kind of education, more students will follow that kind of education. If we reduce the number of school hours, school children will become more creative in their spare time. Lots of people have ideas in their heads about these links between different parts of the institutional pattern. The question is not finding the sociological laws. They're all over the place. Everybody's got them. If I do this, then that will result. If I give children more education about the environment, they will recycle plastic better. Absolutely no evidence for it being true, but people have got it in their heads. The problem is not finding sociological laws, it's finding sociological laws that actually work. And that's much more difficult and is the job, as Holmes saw it, of the comparative educationist. So I just wanted to mention that I'd failed to put into my original explanation the importance of these links between the different parts of institutions that we don't choose, but the world fights back against us. And if we're going to arrange education systems effectively, we need to understand the links, we need to understand the sociological laws.